Now, this is something you can do mainly with AD and AS diagrams, which is very, very simple, very, very easy. So we might actually be able to cover most of the key stuff here in the remaining, say, 20, 15, 20 minutes. So what is an output gap? An output gap is when there is a difference between actual and potential GDP. So to simplify that in terms of a diagram, we'll use the simplest output gap diagram, GDP time a trade cycle diagram rather than ADAS. So this is the trend or potential growth path of the economy or GDP over time. And let's have an example. This is the actual. So hopefully you're familiar with this diagram. It's used to demonstrate the concept of the economic cycle, which is that whilst economies typically tend to grow over time. So this relates to what I was saying earlier. You look at the past 300 years, it's just up, up, up. But in a shorter time frame, this long-term growth is variable. You fluctuate a lot between like boom periods and then recessions or depressions, and you have booms, recession, depression. Not smooth. It's a very easy way of putting it, right? Your actual growth is not smooth, but the trend over time is upwards. So, okay. A output gap is when there is a difference between actual and potential GDP. That's it. So here, there is no output gap because there is no difference. Here, there is no output gap. Here, there is no output gap. But here is what we call a negative output gap. So any period after T1 and before T2, there is a negative output gap because the actual, the blue line, is less than the potential, which is the fancy way, really, of saying the economy is doing worse than we expect. As that's how you can think of it, right? Negative output gap. The actual is less than the potential. The potential is kind of like what we should expect over the long term. If the actual is less than the potential, you're doing badly. Yeah, you're not doing well compared to what you should expect. All right, and then you guys will never guess. You will never guess we've got after T2 and before T3. I won't patronize you by asking for answers in the chat, but it's a positive output gap, right? Because the actual is better than the long-term trend or better than the potential. And that's kind of like, you're doing good, right? You're doing better than you expect. You're doing better than you almost think your long-term average. And I am simplifying a bit here with the concepts, but I think it's an effective simplification, right? You're basically doing about as well as you expect, doing about as well as you expect, doing worse than you expect, doing better than you expect. Okay, this is the simplest way to show the concept of output gaps. So a second way we can do it, which brings us on to another very simple model of the economy. So this is a very simple model of the economy, it just relates to growth. Another very simple model of the economy is our beloved PPF. So when you want to do a PPF on the economy, you should always do consumer goods, capital goods, because the idea is all goods are split into consumer and capital. So this represents the economic choice about the allocation of resources for the whole economy. You choose between all consumer goods, all capital goods, or a mix of both. And to show a negative output gap, just take any point on the PPF, such as point A, do another point inside the PPF, like B, and then do an arrow, which is your negative output gap. Okay, so the difference between A and B, or the distance between A and B, is the negative output gap. And if you think about it, again, it's the same concept in a way, in that the PPF line shows the potential output, right? It shows you what you could get if you're working very well, very efficiently, okay? So you've got your potential output, and then I am saying with point B that the economy is currently below its potential. It's not operating at its potential, and then the difference between the potential and the actual is the output gap. I should mention as well that the output gap here would be measured like this, right? At point Tx, the output gap is the distance between the potential and the actual. Okay, So positive output gap on a PPF. Answers in the chat. How might we show a positive output gap? Negative, you just show a difference between a point inside the curve and outside the curve. How might we show a positive output gap? Let's see if you can use your intuition. Someone says shift in PPF, and that is a good answer, but it is incorrect because a shift in the PPF would mean a change in potential. So let's say, let me show you what I mean exactly for anyone else that can shift in PPF. So let's say I shift the PPF to here. Let me call that point C. Actually, let me keep point A. What's actually happened if you shift the PPF is there's just a bigger output gap, a bigger negative output gap. And I want, how do we show a positive output gap? So if I shift the PPF, I've kept the actual output the same. I've just shifted the potential output. So now the economy is even further away from its potential. So that won't necessarily give us the answer. Any others? Someone says switch the letters. An interesting suggestion. So let's try that and see what you guys think. So that's B and that's A. Is that change things? Are we saying that now this is the actual output and this is the potential output? Because then I think we've got a problem because, I mean, the PPF line is here. So surely the potential output is still at point B, right? Because that's where the PPF line is. So switching the letters is an interesting idea, but all we've achieved is switching the letters. Okay, well done, Niati. Well done, Drew. Yes. Outside the PPF. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, I didn't say that because you can't get outside the PPF. That's the whole point. We will come to this. We will come to this. Okay. So for now, this is, I'm just telling you, that's a positive output gap. That's how you show it on the PPF. Okay. So if your actual output was at point C, this is higher than your potential. That's the definition of positive output gap, unquestionably. So the question many of you have, I'm sure, is wait. Now I'm confused. Positive output gap. I don't like this. I thought the whole point was you can't get higher than your potential. Isn't that the whole point of potential? It's your maximum. Can't get beyond your maximum. So I will, when we get onto the next set of diagrams, I'll give you a way out of this logically, like a logical way out of it, which it basically argues you can get beyond the PPF, you can have a positive output gap, but only temporarily. You can kind of think of it, it's very Schumpeterian in a way. The existence of a positive output gap will create the conditions to reduce positive output gaps. You can't sustain a positive output gap. It will always it will always deteriorate. It will only be temporary, and hopefully I'll give you a way that will help you make sense of this. So, okay, let's get onto the real juicy diagram, which is how do we do this with an ADAS model? So it's much simpler in these two models. So we'll definitely make a note of this, or of course watch videos later, make a note. For a negative output gap, you can use Keynesian or classical. For a positive output gap, you cannot use Keynesian. I'm not going to have time to explain why, but for a positive output gap, if you want to do ADAS, you must use classical LRS. Not an option to use Keynesian. So, okay, let's do our negative output gap first. That's very easy. So we'll do a classical and a Keynesian model. And remember, the output gap is just the difference between actual and potential output. And this is why we need LRAS, because the LRAS curve is the only demand or supply curve in macro that can show us the same thing as the PPF, this concept of your maximum potential output, or really the corresponding income. So the classical is very easy because it's vertical. It just directly shows you the maximum potential output. And then on the Keynesian, you just draw down from where it tends to perfectly vertical. And gives you a good enough approximation. So, okay, to show a negative output gap on the Keynesian diagram, just stick on an AD curve. Make sure it's towards the flatter part. That's going to give me a GDP value of Y1. And would you look at that, Y1 is less than the potential, right? This is our potential GDP shown by the LRS curve. The actual GDP is at the macroeconomic equilibrium. So that's your upper gap. Very, very nice and simple. Classical, you've got to do a bit more with this one because of the nature of the curve. You will have to draw an AD curve and a short run aggregate supply curve, because in the classical model, it's the short run aggregate supply curve which determines the macroeconomic equilibrium. So the economy will be at Y1, not YFE. And then you've got your output gap. Okay, so again, the concept, and again, I should really be drawing on the price levels, blah, blah, blah. But the concept's pretty simple. LIS, where it goes vertical, that's your maximum, that's your the potential of the economy if all resources are fully employed, YFE. And if your actual macroeconomic equilibrium is below YFE, you've got a negative output gap, right? So let's talk about a positive output gap then. Obviously, as usual, any questions, just throw them in the chat. But with our positive output gap, we are, as I said earlier, forced to use the classical. And it's very interesting why that is. I just don't think there's time. But you are forced to use the classical for a positive output gap. And it's just the reverse of what we did before. So I'll fully label it this time. Instead of putting LRAS far to the right and then drawing the macro equilibrium inward of that, I'm going to do it the other way around. I'm going to draw LRAS far to the left, YFE, and then draw my AD and AAS, short run AS curves further outward to create this macroeconomic equilibrium of Y1. And again, then we have a positive output gap. Okay, and that's it. That's it. Label that PR1. And that's your positive output gap. So again, you can only use a classical model for this, and all you've really got to do is just move the AD and AS to the right or the LRS to the left, so that the equilibrium here is further to the right than the classical curve. So, okay, let's address, I think I might have timed this perfectly actually, let's address the burning question. How is this possible? How can you get above your potential? And why is it likely that this is temporary, not something you can sustain? So I will try and give you guys a clue, and I'd like an answer if possible. So when we say a worker is working efficiently, what exactly do we mean by that? If we look at it like in a real life sense, what does it mean for a worker to be working efficiently? So we might say it's about productivity. It's about how can you get the most out of them with the least input. So if you work someone for 8 hours, will you get higher productivity than if you work them for 12 hours, let's say. So if working someone for 12 hours might enable you to get more output, and it might not be as productive, or working someone 12 hours might be more productive in the short run, but less productive in the long run. Then, like I said, what does FE stand for in these diagrams? It's full employment. So YFE, if you haven't done LRS yet, is the GDP you get when everyone is fully and efficiently employed, which is why I'm talking about efficiently employing workers now, because what we're saying here is you're getting more than if everyone is efficiently employed. So going back to what I was saying, how might this idea of 8 versus 12 hour weeks relate to this concept, right? What does it mean to employ someone efficiently at YFE? That's what's happening at YFE. Everyone's employed efficiently, resources being used efficiently. I have a feeling I'm probably going to need to explain this one, but I'll consider any responses. I would like to get some responses and discuss, if at all possible. So why might the idea of, well, to simplify, 8 versus 12 hour days be relevant here? Okay, I'm gonna put you all out of your misery. So think about it like this. Okay, there's probably an efficient amount of hours to employ a worker, and that's probably 8 9 hours a day, maybe even 7, maybe 4 days a week. I'm not making a clue, but there's some probable optimal amount of time to employ workers. And you could, for example, overwork them. Instead of giving them 8 hours a day, give them 12 hours a day. What's likely to happen to your output in the short run, but what might happen to your output in the long run? That's the question, really. So let's say you've decided that the optimal hours you should give your workers is 8 a day. What might happen to short run output, long run output, or productivity if you make them work 12 hours a day? Anybody? Real life tips. Good, thank you. Good, couple of answers straight away. That's what I like. So we might expect it to increase in the short run because obviously everyone's doing 12 hours a day instead of 8 hours a day, but to decrease in the long run. Okay, so basically you can overwork your laborers, you can work them more than is actually efficient to do so to get more output in the short run. But what's likely to happen to those workers in the long run? I think a lot of you have answered have figured out. There's gonna be increased sicknesses, there's gonna be increased what's the word, mental health issues, people not wanting to work, lack of motivation, alienation, whatever you want to call it. People might just quit. So the idea is you can get to a positive output gap by basically over employing the economy's resources, so overusing the workers, over employing the capital, like having all the computers and businesses on or open like 14 hours, 15 hours, 16 hours a day. That will get you higher than your efficient potential, but it's not going to be sustainable because you will burn out the workers. The technical term would be depreciate. If you overuse your facts of production, you will actually cause depreciation in the value or the productivity of those facts of production. So that's the essential theory here. And you can even draw this diagrammatically. It's lovely. So if you have your positive output gap, that's going to result in the long term, too much pressure on workers, too much pressure on capital, workers working too long, not getting enough rest, not feeling motivated, blah, blah, blah. And that will decrease your productivity in the long term, which will increase your costs, which will shift your aggregate supply inwards, like so. Therefore, removing your positive output gap. So that's a really nice way you can use this diagram to show the idea that you can achieve a positive output gap by overusing the economy's resources. But if you do so, you may create a situation, or you're likely to create a situation where the output gap eventually is removed because you've caused your workers to be less productive or caused your capital to depreciate. Like if you're overusing the computers, they start working as well, they need more repairs, blah, 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 blah.